It's wonderful how just standing at a lectern gets the silence as you want it. Marvellous. A couple more people to come in and then we'll begin. Masters, wardens, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly students from the various schools represented here today, welcome to Drapers Hall. We are delighted to see you all here, and the Master Draper, David Chalk, is truly sorry he cannot be here to welcome you in person. Having been involved in the Raleigh lecture from its beginning some 5 years ago, it is wonderful to see that it has evolved exactly the way we had all hoped it would, namely that it has become an educational opportunity for the next generation of potential entrepreneurs we see in front of us today. The Raleigh lecture has become an annual fixture for learning. It is a chance for students to pick the brains of some of our leading entrepreneurs and academics in the fields of enterprise and business. We are all indebted to past master Peter Hewitt, as it was he who came up with the idea of this afternoon's programme. Why here at Drapers Hall? Well, Peter Lionel Raleigh Hewitt is a direct descendant of Sir Walter Raleigh. That is his preferred pronunciation. You may well have seen Sir Walter's coat of arms, which forever is presented in a stained glass window by our main entrance. As a company, we provided some £150, which was a lot of money in the early 1600s, in support of Raleigh's expeditions to the Americas. He was perhaps one of the first pioneering entrepreneurs. So it is entirely appropriate that we, the Drapers, should have such a close affiliation with the entrepreneurs. And with that in mind, it is with my absolute pleasure that I now hand over to the master entrepreneur, Mr. Lars Andersen, to introduce the Raleigh Lecture 2021. Thank you.
Students, masters, wardens, ladies and gentlemen. As the master of the Company of Entrepreneurs, it is my pleasure to invite you to the third Raleigh Lecture by the entrepreneurs. We believe this is the premier event combining sixth form students and masters of livery companies in the City of London. This lecture, named, as we heard, after Sir Walter Raleigh, originally set up by past master Peter Raleigh Hewitt. He took all my notes already here. Each year we look at one aspect of entrepreneurship, and we invite a number of sixth form students to discuss the topic, as well as including a speaker to deliver the main lecture. Following this lecture, I invite you to join me for refreshments in the other room. My mother livery company being World Traders, the topic of globalisation is very close to my heart. And I'm delighted that we have an excellent speaker tonight. Dr. Serena Masino is Association Professor in International Development and Economics at the University of Westminster. Dr. Masino worked at the University of Oxford as a postdoc and holds a PhD from the University of West Manchester. She has worked with a number of United Nations organizations, such as the World Food Programme. So please welcome Dr. Serena Masino.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Serena, as has been said. What I'll try and talk to you today about is a mix of opportunities and threats that we face when we talk about globalization. And I know that I'm talking to future potential as well as probably current business leaders. So I'm going to try and give you perhaps a snippet of what could be the other face of globalization. And I'm going to try and problematize some of the dimensions that are associated specifically with economic globalization. There are different facets to globalization, but we'll be focusing on economic globalization. Oh yeah, that's me. Okay. So we know that physical, financial, productive integration. Yeah, yes, sorry, yeah, so I'm just used to like walking up and down when I give lectures at university, but I'll stay put here. So physical, financial, productive integration has increased to unprecedented levels. But with this, challenges have also increased. Productive displacement, and we will talk about this in a minute, and segmentation has increased. The frontier of possibilities, thanks to advances in science and technology, is also ever increasing, but so is vulnerability. I mean, think about the pandemic. This has been, it's been made easier by the mobility that we also enjoy thanks to globalization. As two of the S's in your resource pack have also highlighted, it is true that entrenched hierarchies are much more easily overturned by emerging powers, but it is also a lot more destabilizing today because of ripple effects. And we all know, because of COP26, of course, that climate regulation faces newer challenges because of integration. Is it possible to measure the phenomenon? Because we are focusing on the economic aspect of it. It isn't very easy to do. There has been an attempt in the 2012 UNCTAD World Investment Report with data based on 2010, so bear in mind that this has gone a lot further, obviously, today. There was an attempt at measuring it which came up with these two figures. The combined home and foreign production of the multinational enterprise, that's what we call M&Es, apparatus, was about 25% of the world output at the time. That is staggering. And about a third of our global exports. I mean, if you think about it, we know that some multinational enterprises' GDPs are higher than the GDP of a whole country. We are, of course, talking about like a low-income, small country, but still, to think that one company's output can be bigger than a whole country's output gives you the idea of what we mean by corporate globalization, which is a concept that you've explored in one of your essays as well. I want to present this short snippet from a TED Talk by Professor Ian Golding. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He's a professor of globalization and development at the University of Oxford. And he puts it very bluntly, but also very powerfully. Okay, so he talks about the challenges in our global future. So I was told how to start this. I think it's just that. Yeah.
Globalization is getting more complex, and urbanization, integration, coming together leads to a new renaissance. It did this 1,000 years ago. The last 40 years have been extraordinary times. Life expectancy has gone up by about 25 years. It took from the Stone Age to achieve that. Income has gone up for the majority of the world's population, despite the population going up by about 2 billion people over this period. And illiteracy has gone down from a half to about a quarter of the people on Earth. A huge opportunity, unleashing of new potential for innovation, for development. But there's an underbelly. There are two Achilles heels of globalization. There's the Achilles heel of growing inequality, those that are left out, those that feel angry, those that are not participating. Globalization has not been inclusive. The second Achilles heel is complexity, a growing fragility, a growing brittleness. What happens in one place very quickly affects everything else. This is systemic risk, systemic shock. We've seen it in the financial crisis, we've seen it in the pandemic flu. It will become virulent, and it's something we have to build resilience again. A lot of this is driven by what's happening on technology.
Just going to skip forward. So he's identified two Achilles heels, that's how he calls them. We are going to be focusing on the first of the two. Okay, so we'll be talking specifically about inequality and how globalization and its dynamics can deepen, widen inequality trends. We'll see which ones as well, okay? You probably know that widening inequality has been at the heart of a number of NGO anti-sweatshop campaigns that students also joined in. I've put here a couple of links. We don't have time, unfortunately, to go over this, but hopefully if you get a copy of the slides after, then you can look at this in your own time if you're interested to see, to learn about Naomi Klein's. What these campaigns have done chiefly in the 90s, okay, so we are talking about a different phase of globalization to the one that we are in today, but they help to raise awareness, specifically among consumers, of the challenges of producing transnationally, okay, and they have been precursors to what we call today codes of conduct for industries and corporate social responsibility management. Now, fast forward to today almost. This is from 2015. Taken from The Guardian. Nestlé's farms in Côte d'Ivoire, these cocoa farms, were found to be exploiting underage laborers, child labor. Okay? Child labor on cocoa farms and farms in general is not a new phenomenon to the country, and it's not new to West Africa in general. Often migrants that come without documents enter countries and then work as child labor because they live on farms. Nestlé said that they didn't know about this. Okay, so they produce there because they get the raw material to produce then chocolate, your Cadbury chocolate in the UK. They do not know who's farming those cocoa beans. That's what they said. They don't have a way to know because inspectors, although inspectors visit the farms, they don't have a way to check whether who's working on the farm is actually underage. They don't have documents. This is what Nestlé says. So the question to you is, should Nestlé have known? Should they have known better? We'll pause there, so keep these questions in mind. This is another snippet from the Business Insider, tracing the progress that Nike did from the 1990s when reports of exploitations of workers had started coming up, to it being a pioneer of codes of conduct and labor inspections and so on. There's a couple of quotes that I'm going to quickly go over with you, taken from one of the most famous economic development textbooks at university. Talking about Nike, in the 1990s, the advantage of locating in Indonesia was that a pair of shoes selling for $80 in the US would involve direct labor costs in Indonesia of only $2.60. Although the subcontractors who sold their output to Nike were pressured to pay a minimum wage of $52.5 per month, they often do not. One 22-year-old and his 19-year-old wife, both employees of a Nike subcontractor, rented a 6-foot by 6-foot space described as follows. A single bare bulb dangles from the ceiling, its dim glare revealing a plain bed, a single gas burner, and a small plastic cabinet. Their room, one of a dozen in a long cement building, is provided with 1 container of water daily. If they want more water, each jug costs about 5 cents. Now, the key word here is subcontractor. Okay? Now, I don't know if any of you recognizes this picture. This is from the Rana Plaza disaster that happened in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2013. The building collapsed, killing hundreds of workers. These workers were working for subcontractors or sometimes subcontractors, producing for very well-known big brands in the US, in Europe. For example, one of the tags that was retrieved that hadn't completely burned out it read Walmart, right? When Walmart got questioned about this, they had no idea that their garments were being produced in the Rana Plaza. The building had been marked as unsafe to work in. The government hadn't intervened. These companies did not know that production was going on for their brand in those buildings. Something very similar happened with Ivy Park, owned by Beyoncé. It was found out that women were being paid under the living wage. It happened also during the women empowerment campaign the Spice Girls launched in 2019, I think it was, just before COVID, when they got reunited and they printed all these nice T-shirts for women empowerment, and then it was found out that these women were being paid below the minimum wage. Now, Walmart didn't know, Ivy Park didn't know, the Spice Girls, of course, didn't know. We're not questioning whether they knew or not, But we are asking, should these companies have known? Should they have known better? Okay? Now, what is important here is I was told not to go back, but unfortunately I have to, so I'm going to try and hope. Yes, it worked. So what is key here is the role of subcontractors. So we know that globalized transnational production networks today make use more and more of value chains. Okay, so we have these lead firms based in the global north, let's call it. They have workloads, so they want things done by the end of the month, say. So they'll go with their consignment to Bangladesh, and they'll say to the big, formal, government-registered contractors, we want this by the end of December in time for Christmas. To do this, they need to employ a lot of subcontractors. Okay, so this is fast production. It's not just fast food, it's also fast garment production. These subcontractors, or sub-subcontractors, or sub-sub-subcontractors, the more you go down in this hierarchy, the closer you get to informality. So at some point, these subcontractors stop being registered with the government. They do not pay taxes, they cannot host labor inspections. They work by standards which are probably not the ones that the lead firm has agreed to when he said, yes, I'm giving the consignment to you. Okay, so along this value chain, at some point, lead firms lose track of what's happening. And this is where working conditions deteriorate. Okay? So the question we're asking here is a lot more complex of whether globalization is good or bad. It certainly is good for many things. Those people wouldn't have a job without Walmart being in the country. At the same time, are they being exposed to a level of vulnerability which is even higher sometimes than not having a job? And how does this happen? So the question we need to ask is, rather than is globalization good or bad, is could it be better? And if so, how can it be made to be better? Specifically, we want to understand under which conditions globalization, or in this case, so let's call it a bit more by its specific name, transnational production, transnational investment, under what conditions can it be good for the most vulnerable in the world? Okay, so this is what my own research is about, so that's why I'm focusing specifically on working conditions. My work has focused on Ghana specifically in the construction sector because we know of the booming construction sectors in most African countries. So my work has focused on working conditions for workers in working for transnational production networks. And the reason why I say to you that it's actually very complex, and we need to go beyond this very easy categorizations, is because when you ask people in low-income countries, in countries that are hosting transnational production, you find that, so if you see, just move for a second. So you see here, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, I don't know if you can read it because the picture is not very clear. 56% of the respondents from the African sample agreed that growing global trade and business ties are very good for my country, but this is only 28% in Europe. 10% of people in the African sample thought that globalization had a bad effect on their country, but 27% did in Europe. Here you can see that the countries at the top of the list, so these are many of the so-called newly industrialized economies, Vietnam, Philippines, India, Thailand, think that globalization is overall a force for good in their countries. But at the bottom is Great Britain, the US, France think that it's a force for bad. So how do we reconcile this? If workers are exposed to more vulnerability as a result of transnational production, how do we explain these answers? So you can see now that there's a lot of complexity here. So to find answers, we need to go beyond the easy, sort of like blaming multinational corporations, the big businesses, they're powerful, they're evil, or the reverse. Okay? And this is where my work is mostly focusing on, there are differences in power, okay? People are definitely very happy to be offered a job when they did not have one. if transnational business comes with a lot of jobs being offered, they're definitely happy to be taking that. At the same time, what we need to look at is the quality of those jobs being created, the quality of economic activity, whether it offers social upgrading rather than just a job. Okay? The concept of winners and losers is something that we'll try and introduce now. So the idea is that there are some definite winners, transnational business obviously being one of them, but also winners among people that collaborate with them or work for them. But there are also definite losers. What we want to do is maximize the amount of winners and provide safety nets for those that will inevitably lose out from the process of globalization. Specifically, we want to find ways in which countries and production agents reap gains from each other's existence in a mutually beneficial way. That would be what we could call a fairer globalization. Okay, so let's get a little bit more technical. What is FDI? What is foreign direct investment? Which is what multinational enterprises are really engaged in, right? So we want to differentiate this chiefly from portfolio investment because it's a type of investment that is safer for countries, for host countries, and that is more tangible, is more rooted in the country, is not as volatile. So that's a plus. What attracts it? Privatization does, rule of law enforcement, viable infrastructure, reliable infrastructure, political stability, and government incentives, so tax holidays and the like. Note that Chinese FDI has been known to not really follow this paradigm. I mean, so for example, Chinese investors were investing in Sierra Leone during the Civil War. So this isn't necessarily applying to all types of FDI, but in general. So can FDI contribute to economic development? It can increase capital, investment, output, and employment. Nike itself employed only 75,000 workers by independent subcontractors in 1993, but in 2007 this went up to 800,000. Okay? The question is what type of employment, as we said. FDI can fill into the savings and foreign exchange gap. Normally, countries that host FDI, not normally but often, they might need extra foreign exchange from their imports. If multinational corporations, if transnational business exports what they produce, they also get the country in a position where they can use that for their imports. FDI could contribute to the public budget if it paid taxes, but it is oftentimes the case that they get tax rebates. Otherwise, they won't really go to that country unless they get disadvantages. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, this is the key point, crowding in and crowding out. How many are familiar with the concept of crowding in and out? Okay, well, a few. So the evidence you probably know then is mixed, right? So there's definitely crowding out the moment that the company comes in and displaces any local company that cannot produce as productively in the same sector. However, it could attract companies that provide services or produce parts and components that are complementary to its production process. The question is, what prevails? Does the crowding in prevail, or does the crowding out prevail, or the crowding in? Okay, there is a net effect, a general equilibrium effect that we're looking at here. If we want the positive to prevail, then often it is the case that someone, maybe the government, needs to intervene to make sure that companies that are being displaced can productively reinvent themselves to be someone that can collaborate so that the net effect is positive. Okay, so once again, even among the companies, there are winners and losers. How can we maximize the winning in each situation? FDI can transfer knowledge, technology, managerial know-how even, And this happens in various ways. It happens directly through training. It happens through spillovers. So, for example, people that have worked for a transnational business then go on and open their own company. Or it can happen through demonstration. So, for example, suppliers in the value chain get demonstration and knowledge from the company they collaborate with. Or even involuntarily, competitors can observe and learn. But bear in mind that MNEs are obviously very protective of their cutting-edge technology, so they're unlikely to be wanting to transfer more than the basics. And if they do, they sometimes place restrictions on workers. They can't really go out and then set up their own company or work for competitors for quite some time. So it's not that easy. These two concepts as well. FDI will have very different impact and create very different inequality profiles depending on the sector that is in. FDI in the textile sector, a labor-intensive sector, is very different from FDI in the oil extraction sector. Does anyone know why? What would you guess why? What makes it different from the inequality and development point of view? Yeah, so there are many people employed to start with, so it's capital intensive. And secondly, not necessarily, but it's often the case that the investing company doesn't find the human capital that it needs in the place where they're going to invest. Okay, so they need to bring the engineers from wherever it is that they're from. And so, I mean, what's left then for the host country? Taxes are probably not paid because this is usually how it goes. Workers are not being transferred any knowledge, so there is extraction of oil. Okay? This is very different to other sectors where there can actually be a lot more engagement, a lot more transfer of knowledge. Not necessarily just the textile sector. Think about even in technology. Okay, so when I was in Ghana, Huawei had just recently taken over even from Vodafone actually, and they were hiring 300 local engineers. They were all working as local engineers for Huawei Vodafone. That is very different from other types of investments. So we need to think about this. So the impact will depend on where this FDI is which sector it is located in. And we need to think about a technological gap, which is related also to this. So if the host country isn't anywhere near the technological ability required to absorb the knowledge that can be brought in by this incoming FDI, there isn't going to be much benefit. So this notion of absorptive capacity is important. Coming to inequality, so talking about inequality more specifically, what type of inequalities can be exacerbated by the presence of transnational business? So if you think about probably quite typical low to middle income country, there will be two sectors to the economy. There will be a more urban, perhaps coastal for countries that have a coast area that is more easily fitting into transnational production networks. The capital, other urban areas. And then there is a vast rural area that is excluded from this process, right? So intervening globalization of production creates a wedge that is widens the wedge between these two areas. It creates a dualistic path of development. So those that were already more backward will lag even further behind. And the rest of the country will benefit from it. And this translates also on the skill dimension, on the income dimension. So people with skills, with income, that have had the opportunity to get training to tap into globalized networks of production will benefit disproportionately more from all others. Okay, so we have widening inequality dimensions under different respects. And then, how many of you know much about the so-called TRIM agreements that came out of the WTO negotiation rounds in the 90s? Not much? Okay. So the so-called newly industrialized economies, as well as South Korea and Taiwan. So these are countries that in the 50s and 80s went through an incredibly fast process of industrialization. These are countries that didn't have many natural resources. What they did have is obviously first mover advantage and a particularly favorable global economic environment. So they made use of local content policy, whereby they asked incoming FDI to purchase locally, to purchase inputs locally in production, to hire locally, to export part of what they were producing. So they set all these requirements and also requirements for knowledge transfer. These are not possible, they are no longer possible under the TRIMS agreements. Okay, so in 1994, with the Uruguay rounds of the WTO negotiations, these local content was banned. Okay, so it isn't possible to ask companies to buy locally, to buy inputs locally, so that the local economy, even the local economy that isn't necessarily related through parts, components, and services, can benefit. It's not possible to do this anymore on grounds of efficiency. So the idea is that those inputs are not very efficient. You can't really ask a foreign company to use them. You can't force them to having to use them. Okay, so this actually limits the potential for local development and positive impact quite a bit. What are the options that are left for government specifically? Nowadays, it is common practice to mandate a labor policy whereby whenever companies want to hire expat personnel, for every one expat, they need to hire 10 local personnel of equal rank, let's say. This is a problem in itself when there aren't that many. Okay, so you can easily see that this could actually outstretch the potential. Mandatory partnerships, so companies coming in have to select a local partner with which they'll collaborate and to whom they'll transfer knowledge. China has made a lot of use of this, but China has a lot of power in negotiations. Other countries, not so much. For example, in my work in Ghana, I found out that often this was cosmetic, it was just a facade. So foreign countries were paying a local company to say, yes, we are partners, but this was just so that they could get, the tax rebates from the government. It wasn't actually happening on the ground. So again, we need to also talk about the politics. A plus, on the other hand, is that countries today, low-income countries today, have more leverage. In the 90s, there were few multinational corporations, very powerful agents, and everyone was competing to attract them. Some governments were competing to attract them. So if you don't give them the right conditions, they'll just go to the next country. But nowadays, transnational business is obviously competing among themselves as well. So countries have potentially more leverage in negotiations. This is something that we need to bear in mind. In one of your essays, it is argued that actually this isn't really of the extent required to trickle down to workers. So there is discussion going on that. And then the enforcement of corporate social responsibility. Now, the debate around that is that sometimes when governments are really strongly in favor of corporate social responsibility and try to enforce it as much as they can, this is because they want that to detract from public policy responsibility. So they'll get the companies to spend in the education sector so they don't have to. Okay, so again, pros and cons to that. But there is, obviously, for companies that have above a certain threshold of turnover, they have to spend at least 2% in CSR. So what else could government do? There's a lot of talk of labor inspections. Okay, so inspections can make sure that whatever activity is going on in companies, whatever productivity gains consumers and companies are experiencing is also translated to workers. However, again, is not as easy. A very interesting Huffington Post article by Hobb points out the Gap, Primark, H&M, and so on. They are the least likely to be to be the ones exploiting workers, because really they know that they're under the spotlight. They know that they get checked by consumers all the time, by the campaigns, and they don't want to lose their reputation of a scandal. So it is typically true that if something does happen, they did not know. And it's also the case that that's not where we're more likely to find abuse today. They do send inspectors. They have inspectors sent out periodically, but workers within the companies know they're instructed to replace the fire extinguisher where it needs to be, along the rooms where the inspector will go, to hide underage labor and so on. It's not easy to spot something if the company doesn't want it to be coming out. And bear in mind that, as I said to you, the key is the chain, okay? It's not the lead firm. So many of these subcontractors, contractors and subcontractors, also produce for the local market. And often, if consumers in the local markets aren't as picky as consumers in the global north, there's no reason to respect any type of labor standards. So sometimes it is really just a facade. But what can be done? Compare these situations. Uganda has 120 trained inspectors for a population of 40 million. Bangladesh has 125 inspectors for 75 million workers. Cambodian inspectors earn less than half as much as the garment workers they are supposed to inspect. On the other hand, Brazil has 3,000 inspectors with a monthly salary of $5,000+ who are very well connected to the network of public prosecutors, as well as with NGOs, as well as with government agencies and unions, which are quite powerful in Brazil. So in that case, the government has taken ownership of the inspectorate policy without leaving it to transnational businesses themselves, who on the one hand cannot know everything that goes on because companies are very skilled at hiding it, and on the other hand might not have an interest in doing that. So there is a way to go around it. I mean, when I've spoken to Brazilian colleagues, they said, oh, there's a lot of corruption there too, sure, but at least it's a step forward. So in other cases, there hasn't even been that step. So in this case, we've given the inspectors quite a big incentive through quite a big salary, and we've connected them with public prosecutors. So this makes it a lot more effective. So we're talking about labor inspections, but how can we really make it meaningful? Okay, so this is something to think about. Now, how am I doing for time? Because I haven't really asked, how many minutes do I have left? 10, okay. So we have time to watch this. This is 3 minutes, but I didn't know, so I left it at the end because I didn't want to. Now, we have talked mostly of low-income and middle-income countries, okay? I don't want you for a minute to think that the global losers are concentrated in those realities only, okay? So this is snipped. How many of you know of Ken Loach, the director? One person. Only one? A few more. Okay. So he's a very well-known director. He covers social policy, public policy, controversial politics in Britain. The person I'm going to be showing you now, I don't know how many of you have already watched this film, so I apologize to the ones that already have. If not, I definitely encourage you to go and watch it, because he is a global loser from Britain. Based on this, many people say this is actually what's behind Brexit. So people are not against Europe, people are against globalization. Some people that definitely stand to lose from globalization, they are all over the world, but they have very different profiles. Okay, so the ones that we've talked about up to now, those are the global losers from low-income, middle-income countries. But there are very many here at home. Okay? So this man used to be a carpenter all his life until he started suffering from a series of heart attacks. Due to that, he had to leave his profession. He's almost at pensionable age, come out. But then when he got better, to go back in, he was now faced with a world of job centers, employment applications. He doesn't know how to use a computer. He's been a carpenter all his life. So I'm just going to play this, and then say
Job
something.
Centre Plus. And here we are, claim job seekers. Okay, so double click on that one.
Right.
And then we need to scroll right the way down here to continue. And that's your form there for you. So you need to run the mouse up the screen, click into there and put your postcode in.
Run the mouse up the screen, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
No?
No, not quite like that. What you need to do is get your cursor.
Your cursor.
Yeah.
Fucking apt name for it.
So when you're moving your mouse, you see what I'm
Can the
doing with my
volume be a
hand?
bit
Aye,
higher at
right.
all?
Look at my hand.
Alright. Alright, it moves later.
And then continue.
Right, okay.
And then you start from there, okay?
Okay.
I'll leave you with it. Okay?
Right. Excuse me, Pat. You couldn't help us with this, could you?
Yeah. What is it?
Just filling this in. I can't get the. This keeps darting all over the place. What do I do? Do I get onto that? Do you just? I mean, how do you get this down?
Right, so you're controlling this and you click on this bar
Right.
and then you pull it down
Oh, right.
and then you get...
What do I hold
rest of-
that on there? Do I?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then I
On
can
the left
just.
side.
What? So I hold this and just pull that down
Yeah, and click the left.
and click to the left. Well, what-
Yeah.
Right, and I've just put that in there. Oh, that's right. Thanks very much.
It's fine.
Bye. You're a star. Right. Right, have I done? Right. Yeah. Oh, bloody hell, what's this now?
Because now finally
Error.
coming to the end of this
What about-
application that you were supposed to fill in.
Yeah, mate, you'd even know what I've done here, do you? This error and
that's
thing.
a big sign.
Do you? I don't know, I
Fine,
was just
mate,
filling in
just-
the thing and it just went...
There we go.
Oh, yeah, there we go. We're back on. Right. Okay, can you just hang on
sorted,
just
yeah?
for 2 seconds so I didn't go back here again? I'll... Just lad, do a couple of more questions.
Yeah, I'll just stand
and
over
then-
here, don't worry.
Are you...
Yeah.
Yes, right. I'll do that. Right, what's...
Then we should continue. Should be alright.
Right, okay.
Right. What's...
It's not bloody... It's not... Well, now it's happening
Just
now.
give it a second. Just give it a second.
But it's just not moving. I mean, look, it's not even...
Give me
It's not
a
even
second.
moved.
Let me try, right?
What, yeah, get that. This is driving me mental, this. I mean, what have I done now?
It's frozen.
It's frozen.
Yeah.
Wait, can you defrost it?
No, mate, I can't. Turn your time's up.
What?
Your time's up.
Your time's up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, mate. Oh, sorry, mate, yeah. I'll just leave it to it.
So this is just to say, some people, in this case Daniel Blake, right? It's very hard for them to retrain, to be redeployed in the global economy in a way that makes them productive. He's almost come to the end of his working life. He has to do all this if he wants to keep on getting benefits, even just for that. But it's very hard for him to reinsert himself in this new technology era that he doesn't know anything about. Those are the global losers that need a safety net. It's very hard for them to be converted into productive agents again in a world that they do not know about. We can see all the benefits of the technology era that we're in, but he really cannot. So, I mean, some people think that there is an obligation to provide safety nets to the inevitable losers that we have in all different societies. That is a global loser from here, as I said. But the global losers in Bangladesh are probably the women that died in the Rana Plaza disaster. They were there to work because they needed money. But the type of employment that they were offered was even more vulnerable than the one that they had before. Okay. Now, to draw to a close, we have said that globalization creates definite opportunities, so this is not up for question. But at the same time, it is also likely to widen income, skill, and regional inequalities on a case-by-case basis, depending on the situation. Some stand to gain, the winners, but there will be inevitable losers. This depends on various things. It depends on the nature of the transnational business coming to your country, which sector is it in? Is it high tech, low tech, capital intensive, not capital intensive? Are the tax rebates, is the company contributing to your budget, and so on? Okay, so all the various dimensions that we've discussed earlier. There is a key role here for national governments. They need to be empowered, often they are not, to be able to provide the safety nets to those losers. At the same time, transnational business needs to be held accountable because they have a disproportionate market power. This is what leads us to say that although we know that they're not governments, nor are they charity agents, they do actually have an obligation to counteract the negatives of their actions on account of their disproportionate market power. That's it from me. So I'm open to questions. I'm happy to answer them one by one as they come, if there are enough, or to take them in a group if they are related. I think there is a microphone. Would you like to repeat the question? So, because I could hear you, but I'm pretty sure the people at the back could not.
Is this microphone on? Yes. Okay. So if you'd like to ask a question, there's two of us. There's a gentleman on the other side as well. We'll pass your microphone so that you can make your question clear. Sorry to ask you to do it again. You state your name and then your question. Thank you.
I'm Benedict. My question is, whose responsibility do you think it is to sort of provide these safety nets for the people who need them, especially for those people who are affected by these sort of big corporations and their subcontractors?
Yeah, so I mean, that responsibility lies quite obviously with the state primarily, because even though companies take a portion of, for example, social safety contributions, pensions, and so on, the regulation comes from the state. Okay, so local governments have to be in a position to provide that. They often have that regulation, they often have the legislation, but they don't have enough political power to enforce it. So that's a slightly different thing, that's the challenge.
My name is Reese, and I wondered, what's your personal opinion on globalisation? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing?
I didn't catch it, sorry.
Do you think globalisation is a good thing or a bad thing? Like the broad terms of things.
You mean me
personally, your view?
Yeah. So that's actually part of my personal views. Like, I don't really have an answer to this. I don't think you can answer it in that way. I think it's good for certain things and bad for others. So my personal view is that it definitely can be a positive if we know how to maximize those positives, to spot them and correct the negatives.
Annie? My question is, with COVID and the vitriol against countries like China and Russia at the moment, globalization, I think, is changing out of sight. And I just wondered how you would see this happening over the next few years. Are we going to become more insular? Are we going to bring so much more manufacturing and production home? I mean, I just cannot see globalization going the way your original chart showed in the ensuing future.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I mean, it's very hard to predict, so I don't have any pretense to know. What we could see even before COVID, though, was a response, a protectionist response from many of the very big world players to migration. So one thing that we haven't covered in this lecture is obviously the massive flows of migration that globalization has enabled. There has been this insular response to that well before the pandemic. This has come in the form of Brexit in this country. It has come in the form of Trump's protectionism in other countries. And so, I mean, so like what you were saying is, like, could it be reverted? Some other people say it comes in cycles, so it has historically undergone cycles. So we're probably now in the insular phase, and it might come back up in the future. But yeah, there's a definite trend towards reverting it at the minute. I think there was a question here first, and then there. Oh, I'm happy to.
Hi, I am Thomas. I was wondering if you think it's the national government's responsibility to put out those safety nets for the global losers, or whether they should sort it out themselves.
So you're asking whether... Could you repeat the last bit?
Whether the national government, is their responsibility
if
to
it is.
implements safety nets or not?
Well, I mean, so what I mean by safety nets is, you know, your progressive taxation regulation. So this is a safety net. Pension, the national insurance contributions. So these are the safety nets. So are you asking whether I think that it should actually be their responsibility in the first place, or whether this should be implemented in countries that do not have this type of policies? I do think it should be their responsibility, because obviously they're elected by all. Yeah. Yes, there.
Just going back to the previous point on a more insular, globalised world or localised world, what sort of risk does that place, though, to workers in the UK? If we think about the situation in Leicester, for example, during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two levels of risk, really, perhaps more. So I see two levels here. One that is coming from trends attached to globalization, so the fact that businesses might leave because of COVID, because COVID is hitting really hard. And then there is another level that is coming from the globalized tendency to flexibilize and casualize labor. Now, the issue is that has come first, okay? So casualized and flexibilized labor is pretty much a reality of the gig economy, for example, today. What happened to all those workers during COVID? So all those workers that could no longer work during COVID, where they were more flexible or sometimes informal, they suffered a lot more. At the same time, some others, people were not going to restaurants anymore, they were getting deliveries, so they happened to be in luck. But that was just out of luck, right? So the point is that if we make them a lot more vulnerable, when a shock hits, it could hit them in the bad way. Yeah.
Given that the losers from this process, particularly domestically, have been quite apparent for quite a long time in developed economies, why do you think that policymakers haven't done anything about it, or enough significant things yet to place those safety nets in place?
Well, I mean, we would need to talk for hours. But, so the short answer to this is, on the one hand, governments in some countries often do not have as much policy making and public leverage as we think they do. They rely on this foreign direct investment because they have very tight budgets. They cannot impose as many conditions as they wish. On the other hand, safety nets are connected to fiscal policy, they're connected to an administrative apparatus. It is the case that in many Latin American countries that has already been built and is well underway because they have government policy schemes, just cash transfers, okay, for people. So that's quite solid, and it's been underway since the 90s. This is the case in a number of South and Southeast Asian countries. In Africa, this is in its infancy. There's a lot of talk today. How can we make the continent progress fairly? It is potentially, like, you know, the way inequality is growing in Africa is nowhere else in the world today. And that's also because there is no scope to build fiscal systems. taxes are not collected efficiently, safety nets are not provided by the states because there isn't an apparatus that can do it. So there's these layers, sort of like intersect to make it particularly bad and difficult to intervene.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Just moving on to your last point there. Investors need to be held accountable. How do you envisage that happening?
So I think it depends on the sector. Okay, so investors in garment, so investors in what we call customer-facing sectors, such as horticulture, such as garment production, they are being held a lot more accountable than others because of the campaigns and, like the awareness that has been raised around this. It's not perfect by all means, but there is a lot more awareness there. So once again, I see the role of host countries, policymakers as key in this, in holding them accountable by making sure that those provisions, for example, what Brazil has done, what we were saying with labor inspections. Now, there are some sectors, though, that flow entirely under the radar. So, for example, the construction sector, where my work is currently focusing in Ghana, doesn't have any NGO participation. People don't really care about this. I mean, people don't really think about the construction workers that work in that sector. So those are like invisible workers. And then in that case, there's a lot more of a challenge. So, I mean, who needs to intervene there? It's easy to put all the blame on the state and say, oh, the state is absent, they're not doing enough. Sometimes they cannot do more. And sometimes it's civil society that should then join forces through NGOs, social enterprises, to create like a counterbalancing role.
I was just wondering if globalization encourages corruption in certain countries.
If it encourages
corruption in certain countries.
Yeah. I mean, so this is an interesting example that I always give my students, which gets them to think. Equatorial Guinea. So if we compare the tables, Equatorial Guinea has a very, very high level of GDP that puts it in a middle-income country category, but then one of the highest deprivation levels in the world. And so I always ask them, what do you think is going on there? Some people know that they are producing oil, and there are multinational, transnational businesses that are drilling this oil. Some of the payments, so some of this activity turns into royalty payments to the government of Equatorial Guinea, which isn't really redistributed to anyone within the economy. So you do see quite a lot of production going on. There is quite a lot of royalties being paid, but where does it go? Okay, so again, we could talk for hours, but yes, there's definitely that potential because there's a political process behind lobbying and attracting transnational investment. Okay, I think that was the last one then. Thank you very much.
We're going to get started now, if that's okay. So, a brief introduction from me. I'm Mark Huxley. I'm currently serving as a junior warden at the Company of Entrepreneurs, and picked up the joy of getting to convene and corral these good folks to talk on the topic for us, and more importantly, I think, to get you guys talking about it. I think we're kind of blessed with a lovely juxtaposition in the room, that you've got some very senior professional folk that have been through their careers, and I think in great many ways have brought us to the place that we're in with globalisation through the different skills we've brought, but infinitely more important, we've got you guys that are the next generation, and we can either celebrate or apologise for what we've left you to look after in your upcoming working lives. So really want to get your voices in the room, so we're going to try and keep this reasonably informal. It's a huge topic, as Serena kind of boldly, bravely tried to take us through, and I think we barely scratched the surface of what we could have spoken about. So we're not going to get through everything, but we'll unpack as much from what you guys shared when you were doing your workshops, what Serena spoke about, and some of the things that were in the papers that you had as your study. So please speak. Please ask questions. No great formality. If you've got something to say, put your hand up. The guys have got the microphones again, probably to help us. If you can stand up when you want to ask the question, so at least we know where the disembodied voice in the room is coming from. So I'm probably going to be a slight kind of agent provocateur and devil's advocate of saying things just to kind of poke sticks at these guys to get them talking. So please don't think many of the things I might say are my opinions, because they're necessarily not, but I'm not here to do that. So without further ado, I think we'll have a little walk down the panel, get the guys, if you could just introduce yourselves, give a little bit of a background and a couple of minutes of what kind of your personal view of globalisation will mean. And let's just try and frame some stuff that then hope that gets us into some questions. So Brigitte Granville, you're first, so yeah. I shall pass across to you.
So I'm professor of international economics, and I'm also I'm the founder of the Center for Globalization Research at Queen Mary, University of London. So when I started and when I created this Center of Globalization as an economist, I thought globalization was a wonderful thing. It was a wonderful thing because, look, we managed to raise many people out of poverty. There is, however, one thing I forgot, unfortunately, is that when we start to look at how we take some people out of poverty, we were looking at the world. And we forgot one thing. We forgot to look at national economy. And while people in China or in India or in some poor country were on average benefiting from this wonderful thing, globalization, some other people actually didn't benefit so well. And the people that didn't benefit were the very people in what we call mature economy. That is in the US, in the UK, in France, in Europe. And those people were the low and middle class people. And the more those big firms, call them multinationals or whatever, were somehow providing everybody, all of us, with cheaper and cheaper goods. We forgot one thing, is that the low and middle income people were actually finding that their living standards were getting harder and harder.
Thanks. My name's Peter Hewitt. I've been an entrepreneur for more years than I can care to remember, but it's more than 40. Set up my first business when I was 24 in property. Have moved into sort of financial services and related. Clocked up 13 public companies as director or chairman, one of which my wife and I set up, and we floated on AIM and grew it quite rapidly. Currently, well, it's a couple of years ago, together with my colleague Duncan, we set up a defense consultancy called Universal Defense and Security Solutions, which has grown and is growing really, really rapidly. It's not an industry I knew anything about, but is truly and absolutely fascinating. We've started to get, even after 2 years, a global reputation, which is very encouraging. I'm also a non-exec of a couple of venture capital trusts, an honorary group captain in the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, and I'm past master of the Guild of Entrepreneurs and a founding Freeman, as well as past master Woolman, and the past alderman of Aldgate. So the thing that fascinates me is the sort of corporate governance element of this, particularly for the global companies. And perhaps later on I can sort of talk a little bit about where the priorities for directors lie, why they aren't perhaps sort of giving charitable donations to the countries, and why perhaps there's sometimes this bit of a gap between the rich and the poor. Thanks.
associate professor at the University of Westminster, as I've said to you before. Part of my work is also consulting for a number of United Nations organizations. I first got interested in the globalization debate when I was a student, like you, perhaps just a little bit older maybe. And I was puzzled by how, on the one hand, you had all the debate about how exploitation goes on with international businesses and so on, but then when you ask people in the countries involved, they're actually a lot more positive than I was about globalization. So this sparked my interest in looking into it a bit further and presenting the type of research that I present, well, theoretical insights and practical insight that I brought to you earlier, but that's where my interest sort of grew from.
Good evening. I'm Duncan Potts. I suppose I'm a little bit different to the rest of the panelists. My main career was in the Royal Navy, where I retired about 3 years ago as an admiral. I think what I bring this evening is not so much an economic approach to globalization, but really my focus is on the geopolitical implications of globalization and the world. And as someone who joined the Royal Navy at the height of the Cold War, saw the Iron Curtain coming down, saw the period of effectively US unchallenged hegemony, and now the rise of China and other actors around the world, I think those all have factors to play. So really look forward to discussing those with you this evening. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you guys. Well, that's... Is that it? Is that the end of the evening?
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So let's start off then with maybe picking up some of the things you were talking about at the end there, Duncan, that we're in COP26, we're in the middle of the discussions and the negotiations that are going on at the moment. We've heard from Serena earlier about the kind of new world order against the old world hierarchy that sat in there, and the kind of East Asian powerhouses that starting to come along against the kind of Western economies. And we also heard about being good corporate citizens, and the word corruption was used. And there was a question right at the end which fascinated me about, are governments big enough to take over the corporations? So again, picking up your point, Peter, about corporate governance. So Duncan, I'm going to throw it back to you first off, but what's your view about where we are as a world state, first off? So if we can establish where we are, then we can work out what's going to work going forward, who are the winners, who are the losers, what's the good, what's the bad. So maybe we'll just start unpacking that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I must admit, I'll kick off. Of course, the person who's used the expression winners and losers most in the last decade is a certain Donald Trump. And actually, I think we need a new sort of paradigm to look at the world. My personal view is that I think there are two grand strategic issues that we face at the moment, and I direct it really to you here, and I think it'll endure for some time. One is climate change, which is happening, and I forgot to say in my introduction, I'm also the chair of the regulatory body for the UK Meteorological Office. So I was up in Glasgow on Thursday and Friday last week. Clearly I don't compete with Obama. I like to say I was at the fringe of the fringe, but it's really important that we come together on that. And the other one is the rise of China. Because when we look back at, traditionally how states and power blocks interact with each other, there's tension there. I'm slightly conflicted about what China means for the world at the moment, because it's very different to what we've seen before. I go back to the Cold War, where we had NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and there were two very different political ideologies facing each other, but also the economies of those blocs hardly touched each other. They weren't intermixed. And where we are in the world at the moment is that we are now entirely reliant upon China, but equally China is entirely reliant upon us, for the well-being of the economy. And I think we all know that economic growth is something that China is now addicted to and needs to perpetuate. So I think that is cause for optimism about how the world evolves. I think there are a couple of touch points that are particularly worrying. I think what happens over Taiwan will be seen by the rest of the world, and in particular those countries who are watching very carefully to see who is going to be the top dog in the world going forward. Is it going to be the United States or it's going to be China? And I think the litmus test will be Taiwan over that. So that is potentially a flashpoint that we'll need to guard against. But so I think there's quite a sort of flip-flop between the two about globalization. I'd also say that the strength of the world going forward will be about communities of countries coming together to have a voice as well. And I think that's particularly important when it comes to the climate crisis and everything out there at the moment. And again, I'm more optimistic about that as well. I think I believe in the ingenuity of the human beings to overcome that in the long run. And I think we may be late, and there may be some damage that might take, decades to repair, but we will get there in the end. Thank you.
So, one of the issues that would come into that then, and the UK is a good example of it, is protectionism and nation state rather than globalisation. So, again, being slightly provocative, and not to turn it into a Brexit debate, but the fact that we dislocated ourselves from a European community, to the points that you were making about that, what do you guys on the panel think about the fact that we've retrenched back and there's a little bit of arms round, nation UK, and when you're trying to look at global issues like climate change, like a post-COVID economy and how are we going to trade around the world, that actually we've chosen to kind of lock ourselves off from it a little bit. Is that something that's going to ripple effect out? Is it a storm in a teacup and we shouldn't worry about the odd boat being hauled into a French port because it didn't have the right license? Or is that something more underlying? And again, this is this global corporate citizenship that we're talking about. So I'll throw that into whoever.
Shall I have a go?
You have a crack.
Well, for me, I perhaps don't hold probably the slightly majority view insofar as I did vote for Brexit. But here's where it is as far as I'm concerned. We joined, and without wishing to reopen the debate, but it sort of gets to the point of where I think we are now. So we joined a European economic community as far as we were concerned. We did not join a community that was looking forward to more breaking down the national barriers, looking at economic and fiscal integration. That's not what the UK signed up for. We're an island nation, and you've got to respect that identity. That having been said, where we are now, of course, is that we are starting to look outwards. There is an industrial policy out there, particularly as I look into our own industry, the defence industry. There's more outward looking. We are now don't have the sort of laws and constraints that perhaps we had before, and I don't think there's protectionism there at all. I think we will, once the government gets its act in order, we will start to be looking outwards a lot more. We need to put more resource into looking outwards.
I think you always have to look at Britain inside history. I mean, for me, the UK, Britain, has what I always call a kind of postmodern economy, in the sense that, the Brits always start to do something and everybody's saying, oh, it's completely crazy what they have done. I mean, why? Brexit. And then a few years later, you realize that actually what they did, they announced the future. What I mean here is that, well, for some, for instance, I'm married to a Remainer. For some, it's something that is very painful. But I don't see why we should say that because a nation, a country, really want to preserve their identity, there should be something wrong about it. Yeah. Now, how do we manage the climate change and the economy at the same time? Again, is what was said here. People are extremely innovative, and it may be a very good thing, because what all the economies are facing right now, and it's not only the UK, it's also France, it's also all the others, and they don't have Brexit, even if in France there are many that never voted for the European Union and really would like to get out. What we see is that we are all facing the same supply chain constraint. We are all facing the lack of workforce, because for too many years the labor force has been underpaid and people don't want to do that job anymore. So it's what we say in economics is that we always have to be able to identify the problems. And very often people look at things, especially journalists, in a very confused way. Not everything is the fault of Brexit, is what I want to say.
Okay. I'm really keen to open this out, and particularly to our younger friends in the audience, because you're going to live in this new world that's been created. So it'd be really good to get your views about how you see yourself sitting in there. So again, we can keep chatting, but please, just hands up. Let's get some of your views, and we can have another voice asking questions to these folks than just me. So anyone got anything they might like to say at the moment, just on what's been said so far? No? Okay. But please, just don't stand on ceremony. Stick your hand up. The guys will see you. They'll throw things at me to make sure that I stop and give you a chance to speak. So let's get into the corporate citizenship part of it then, because, again, some of the stuff we were talking about earlier was, can governments control big global businesses? Is money talking? Tax havens, tax regimes, the ability to lobby for personal interest that sits in. So where are we with that? Do we actually, and I am looking at you, Serena, for an answer on this one. Do you think that those companies are controllable? Do you think the governments can go about it in the right way? Or actually, is it a little bit of a toothless tiger of regulation that's going to sit in to try and control what these folks are doing, but in the sure knowledge, if Google turned up tomorrow and said, you know what, we're going to come out and pull out of London, what the cause and effect of our economy would be?
Yeah, I mean, so we were talking actually about this just earlier, we were debating. So I talked about low-income and middle-income countries where obviously the balance of power is a lot more skewed, right? There's a lot less leverage, but there is some is emerging. At the same time, I don't think it's very different. So the issue of political will and political ability to control those businesses isn't very different between the UK and, for example, Ghana, where I did my research. If Google wants to stop paying taxes, or if we want to allow and condone the fact that they didn't pay taxes, there is a political will behind that. Obviously, we're not making names, but if we want to recoup those taxes, there's also political will behind that. And it's not just Google. There are many more. So I do think, yes, there is scope for controlling them. It probably needs a more united effort than what there is at the minute. And there's also the fact that those businesses do not necessarily want to lose reputation. So creating awareness goes hand in hand with a political will, perhaps. Yeah, this is my personal view.
Okay. I really do want to ask a direct question at the young folk in the room, because you're 16, 17, so you're probably going to vote in the next election. So really, what defines to you, what do you want government to do, in the context of this discussion, the debate you've been having all afternoon? And it would be desperately lovely if someone put their hand up and talk. Come on, it's your future. What do you think governments are doing wrong? What do you think governments are doing right? What role do you think government plays in that society? Lovely.
Yeah.
Stephen, thank you.
Second time caller.
I think that the main issue is sort of like governments following what they're saying. sort of like, I think at the moment, especially when it comes to how they're reacting to these sort of the growing sort of like influence of these companies, is that they're saying they're going to do one thing and then sort of not necessarily following up on that. So I feel like no matter what they're saying they do, I feel like it's more important that they actually follow what they're saying they do. Does that make sense? Rather than saying necessarily they're going to do this, which everyone loves, but then not following through on that. It'd be better to maybe set more realistic expectations, but then actually follow through on them.
So a kind of, to try and not put words in your mouth, but to try and paraphrase that, kind of living a proper trust world, that I'm telling you I'm going to do something, I'm going to walk through and I'm going to do what it is I'm saying, and it's being done for the right reasons. That's a good comment. I'm going to come back on that in a second, guys, but please, I just want to get a few more views if we can. So.
Hi. I find that the government can often be quite single-minded and not really willing to change. Even with advisors sort of going on from what the guy before was saying, I think it's a problem. People don't like change, and we're finding with the climate summit right now, it should have happened years ago, and it's not. And even then, people aren't willing to change. I don't really know how the government are going to fix that, but I think it is an issue.
Okay, thank you. It's just government's talking and not changing. Oh, thank you.
Yes, thanks. Just to borrow from Kate earlier, I was having a chat with a former colleague of mine, and we wondered to what extent is globalisation actually compatible with democracy?
Did you catch that?
No.
Sorry, the sound up here is not absolutely wonderful, but I think you were saying how much is globalisation ultimately affecting democracy?
To what extent is it compatible with democracy?
Oh, is it compatible with democracy? Yeah. So well, again, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm just vaguely looking along.
I was wondering if the question was directed on it. Does anyone want to?
I'll do the first one.
Yep.
Okay, so the government rhetoric. I think the problem has been and I've watched it over the years, that we, in my naivety when I was younger, I thought that actually politicians were there because they were good governors, good corporate governors, good stewards of the country. The reality is that as time has gone on, and particularly with the advent of social media, it is politics as a career in itself. It's not about good governance. It's not about doing the right thing, because social media requires you to have so many hits per day, and if you don't get those hits, you're fairly well out of it very quickly. So I think that the problem is more fundamental than that, and you can see it in other countries, because I'm sure we've all stood back and said, how on earth could a country as large as America, with so much common sense, elect their president before last? How? I mean, it just sort of doesn't work. And at the same time, we see here, we see in the UK, and this applies all over the place, that the politicians are there because they're good politicians, not because they're necessarily good stewards and good governors. So leading from that, and I see it in local authorities, and yeah, I better not say I see it in the City of London Corporation, but I will. But the problem is that, as I said, you get to the top nowadays because you're a good politician, not because you're a good governor or good director of a company, and so on. So there you go. That's my one.
Oh, sorry. Do you mind, Brigitte?
No, please.
No, I wanted to add something. You know, when you say good politicians, of course you have to define it. And I think the way to define it, and it's probably the reason why Trump was elected, is because somehow you have to make sure you give a voice to everybody, and that people trust that they have a voice. If suddenly you treat people of deplorable, or like in France, Macron treated his people with extreme scorn and disdain, people don't respond very well to that, and they stop trusting politicians. So it's very important to have an empathy for the people that you are supposed to be heading.
Yeah, can I just make a couple of observations? Firstly, looking at the world, I think we have an overinflated opinion of what politicians can actually do. We believe that they can change everything, they can affect everything, and they are omnipresent and have the power to do it. I think it's much more limited than that. I also think, because I spend a lot of my time around the world, looking at different forms of government and governance, and I think we sometimes really misunderstand the beauty of democracy, and we confuse it with a voting system on its own, where the first past the post gets all the power and can do what it wants. It's not. I mean, democracy, in its purest sense, is the ultimate tool for limiting the power of governments. And you're limited because people can vote you out at the end of the day. You might not have the majority that you want. And I think that that is something that's very precious to allow us, the people, to flourish within a framework that politicians can set. The opposite, of course, democracy, where you don't have limitations on power, is where you have totalitarian regimes where the leadership is unapproachable, unimpeachable, and has limitless power. And there they can get on and do what they want without really a concern for the individual human rights of people. So my vote, I like democracy, but recognize the limitations of the governments that you get with it. Sorry.
So just on the last point on the compatibility with democracy, I don't really see any incompatibility there. In fact, I think that in the era that we're in today, where information is much more openly available and circulates so fast, in fact, it can encourage participation, it can encourage awareness creation. So I definitely don't see it as incompatible. In fact, I have this hope that it can actually increase participation.
I think the government could do more in terms of doing better for the environment. But do you think it should be the government that picks up the cost for that, or the businesses themselves that fund the improving the environment?
No, I didn't. Sorry, didn't catch.
Can I just leap in there while you think? I really agree with your question there. I think people talk.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, we didn't.
Oh, right. Sorry, Haru. I think it was basically saying that you don't think we do enough about the environment, and could the government be doing more for that? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. No wonder I'm the only one coming in. I'm the only one who heard the question. So there we go. I think it's a really good question. We often talk about the first duty of any government is the defence of the realm. But I also think that the realm is more than a threat from external military forces, and actually the environment in which we live, the air that we breathe, everything about it is a really important part. And I would say that is something that the government, if it doesn't do it all, but it needs a good regulatory framework, because we live in a fragile universe. We're seeing that at the moment. And we have the power as human beings to be able to control it. So, my view.
Again, just to kind of move the debate on a wee bit then, but in that same way, I mean, we live in a hugely disposable world at the moment, which is not anything but environmentally friendly that sits out. We'll buy T-shirts at £2 that you'll wear 3 times and throw away, which is clearly not good for the environment. So are we brave enough to move to what you might call a global economy, that you want the benefit of global reach, but actually you might get forced into buying vegetables seasonally because you've got food miles going on and you don't want the stuff coming in because we want to protect the environment. And that's clearly what we all need to be moving ourselves towards. Or are we slightly kind of NIMBYist about it and just not on my backyard because I still want to have that luxury? So it feels to me that there's a kind of paradigm gap. There's a road that we've got to cross if we're going to be truly environmental. Sorry, that turned into a statement, not a question, so I apologise for that. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that anti-globalist protesters complain about is that large corporations, global corporations, don't pay tax or don't pay enough tax. So recently, world leaders got together to discuss the concept of a global corporation tax of 15%. Does the panel agree that that goes some way to solve some of the problems associated with globalization?
Again, we'll walk it down the table, whoever wants to pick it up first, and we're going to, Brigitte, you want to?
Yeah, but I think in a way the problem is much larger than taxing first. In order to be able to touch those global companies, we really need to have all the big countries to agree on it. The problem is that we call those firms multinationals, but we know that the most important ones are based in the US, and that the US government oppose in general. I mean, there is some change of policy with Biden, but they are really opposed to more taxation on their firm. And until we have this agreement, it's extremely difficult to impose. Yeah? But it's not only, I mean, it's not only, the fact that imposing more taxes also, is that because those multinationals like Apple, like Google, have become so rich, they have an incredible instrument of lobbying. And unfortunately, many politicians are, prone to be lobbied by those firms. And it's extremely hard to attack that. And how you are going to do it, this is, some people in the US are trying to do that by changing the antitrust law, which is not adapted to those firms. Because those firms, what they do is not, the antitrust was to protect the consumer. But here what we try to do is to protect actually the producer. So we have to attack the market power of those firms. And it's quite difficult, but it's starting.
Peter, I mean, you were talking about corporate governance. I mean, safe haven states, that there'll always be a weak place that someone will want to take them in because they want to boost an economy. So how do we overcome that?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, you've just got to look at, the corporate, right at the top level, the vertical of a corporate and a global corporate. Their duty is to their shareholders, quite simply, and that's enshrined in law, effectively, in most countries, certainly in the UK. So if they've got a duty to shareholders, and if, let's take it, and their shareholders are pension funds, which they will be in some other global corporates, then, okay, we want the pensions to maximize their returns, or we want the company to maximize their returns so the pensions can have the best returns possible, because that's about all of us. So the problem comes is, okay, so you're a director of a quoted public company, a multinational. So where do you go to get the best returns for your shareholders? You have to go to a jurisdiction that has the least tax. And so it sort of cascades down from there. From the fundamental principle, you've got a duty to your shareholders as directors, and you're the guys who are directing what the company is doing. Now, when it comes to the sort of, the global taxation element, yeah, it would just be brilliant, as you said, if you could get everybody to agree. The problem is everybody's got a vested interest, and all corporates have got a vested, all countries have got a vested interest. Where it cascades even further down into the, we were talking earlier about the actual producers and the subcontractors of the subcontractors of the subcontractors. So some industries have this duty, financial services in particular, to understand exactly where their product ends up and who's doing what. Others, like manufacturing, this is more about their own ESG policies and about their marketing and about their public perception, because of course if they're quoted companies and people start selling the shares because they don't like what the corporate's doing or how they're doing it, then of course the values go down, and that's not good for the pension fund. So all a big balancing act, really.
Serena, I took a note from your keynote, which was about, you were talking about the emergence of new leading powers can overhaul enriched hierarchies, but can be destabilizing. And I took that as a very strong comment as the kind of state of the world as it is in the now, which I thought was a very fair reflection. Again, in the context of the question, do you want to kind of think a little more about that?
Yeah, I think I was specifically thinking about economic paradigms as well. So globalization in the 80s, 90s, but up until today, so we've seen globalization as a manifestation really of capitalism the way we know it in the West or the North. But then with China, globalization, so bear in mind, a fairly high percentage of the top multinational enterprises around the world are coming from China. But what we see there is a third way, a third model of globalization, right? So coming through what we call state capitalism. And that has a slightly different face to it. So the way it interfaces with productivity, with work ethics, and also with labor relations and labor standards, which can obviously be quite destabilizing. And it's spreading quite rapidly. I don't know what people think about this.
Duncan, do you want a few words? And then we've got a question at the front, Simon.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think the Chinese model, watch it very carefully, and I think, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think there was something about that in one of the papers, you know, very popular with client states, very favourable short-term loans, but if you default, you're in that spider's web of Chinese imperialism, and I think a lot of countries are now watching the United States model of, you know, which Western Europe and part of the Pacific Rim, you know, the Japan, South Koreas, Australias, India, countries like that are part of, and you know, I think we can almost discount Russia as being a separate sort of state, but China has got a web now of, I was going to say client states, it's not quite right, but its economic leverage is extremely powerful. And I think a lot of countries are watching that to see which one we sit within.
Okay, thank you. The floor's yours.
Thank you. Ari Zaman with the Global Entrepreneurship Network and also involved in Commonwealth entrepreneurship networks. Just wanted to ask about, I mean, I think the point around companies and shareholders, I think duties to shareholders is one thing, but responsibility to stakeholders is something that we're also hearing more about. And I want to ask this question in the context of the thing that you haven't talked about this evening, and speaking to some of the students, it was coming up over the refreshments earlier, which is the state of health of world governance right now. Think of these big organizations like the United Nations. Think about the Commonwealth. Yes, the Commonwealth's very active right now in Glasgow, getting countries to realize the importance of these issues. You were there. And the World Trade Organization is another good example of a big organization having a big meeting in a few months' time in December, and yet the health of people trusting each other, developing countries, developed countries, the kind of fallout from the Trump years is still very much with us. You talked about China. There's a lot of distrust on both sides, I think. It's not just, I think, from the west to the east, but it's the east to the west. Glasgow isn't helping. We'll have to see. So my question is around the state of health, around the global governance picture. Brigitte, we were at Chatham House together briefly, and I remember you at that time, but the importance of global governance is really the question I want to ask, because that's kind of the framework that we need. It's business, but we need that as well. So I'd be interested in people's comments.
Do you think, just to lead out your question, do you think that's something which is in the gift of those in power at the moment to actually make an iterative change and move to a better place? Or do you think actually it needs a radical overhaul of, we've got to think about this a different way?
Well, I think it goes to the core of what are we here for? What are we here for? And who are we here for? I mean, the community, the UN, is made up of sovereign states, governments representing people. If you look at the board of the IMF, I mean, Brigitte, you know this better than I, it's made up of finance ministers of countries and politicians who are elected. You know, even the private sector, we have in the UN system, there is, and Google it if you don't know about it, UN Global Compact. This is a network of companies that work with the UN to address some of the big issues like hunger and climate change. So we have those things out there. The private sector is engaged, but is it engaged enough? Are there enough companies, not just from the West, but from the East involved? Are there enough of the tech companies actually involved as well? You know, so I think this is part of the framework. The other point that I just want to ask about is a link to this. There's a big debate, and Brigitte, you'll be very aware of this, is the sense of fairness at the UN. Yeah? Countries that won a war 80 years ago still have a lot of power in the UN setup. Yeah? And so there's a lot of things going on that don't help in terms of building trust in these bigger organizations. So there's a reform process underway in some of these places, but it can hold back some of these bigger discussions around business, about rules and regulations and all of this stuff. And I just wonder whether we've, to what extent have we not thought about that enough?
Uh-huh.
I mean, if we don't get an agreement in 72 hours in Glasgow, that might not help either.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you. Peter, I am good. Sorry, do you mind if I just put this straight to Peter first off? Because I know you've spent your life navigating around some of these waters. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be careful not to ensure that we have got the institutions clear as to what they're doing and who they're representing. So if we've got elected politicians to an organisation, we've got to be clear that's what they do, and I think it would be rather difficult to mix in corporates with it at the same time. And if we take something like NATO, which is, you know, a completely different organisation, which Duncan can speak much better than I can on, then again, this is different. This is not so much elected, this is appointed. So I think we've got to be awfully careful about that. But I think the point you're trying to make is are we doing enough to sort of push these and make these institutions more powerful and more effective in producing a good result? The answer is we need to pressurise our politicians to do more, isn't it? I don't know, but I mean, COP26 is a classic example of, you know, trying to get everybody together and all the leaders and all the decision makers together, but the interests are so diverse from China to the US to the UK. How do you do it? I just don't think it's possible. But that doesn't mean we've not got to keep the pressure up.
Brigitte, sorry, you wanted to say something?
No, question is it more or is it different? I mean, I know those organizations very well. I work there. And what I have seen is an incredible inertia. It's a bit the same problem with the European Commission. Everything starts with, you know, at the beginning when those institutions were born, for instance, the Bretton Woods institutions, 1944. So they were young, very, you know, dynamic. And then there's a lot of bureaucracy. And that's really, and it's not only the bureaucracy. Look at the structure of the IMF. Yeah? Who has a veto? 17% is the United States. How many years have been lobbied for having from different countries the director of the IMF and the director of the World Bank? And look what is happening. Nothing has changed. Yeah? So, as usual, the vested interests are such and the inertia is such that somehow, you know, it's you guys that can make things change. Yeah? It's a new generation with dynamism. And at this stage, frankly, I don't know if we need to reinforce those organizations. Personally, and I know we cannot close any international organization, they never close down, they always go on. But there is certainly a strong need for completely rethink the institution.
So again, I want to address that to our young friends in the audience. I mean, do you think COP26 speaks for you? You know, when you heart, body, and soul, you know, what you see coming out. Do you think it's relevant to you? Do you think it's something you can get behind, or do you think we're all, you know, our generation are taking it completely down the wrong path? Come on, someone's got to have something to say about it.
Mark, how about taking a vote? How about taking a vote?
Yeah, okay, well, let's do that then. That's a good idea, Peter. What about a little show of hands then? Who thinks COP26 is showing a pathway for their future that they could get behind? Okay. No, you don't count, Simon. And who definitely thinks against? So there's a lot of non-opinion coming in, and I'm trying to ignore anybody that looks beyond the age of 17. I know you've got young boyish good looks, but I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, it would be nice to see more hands coming up. I mean,
I've got to say, I'm surprised. I thought you guys, you youngsters, would be all, you know, up for COP26 as being a good step in the right direction. Even though it doesn't achieve necessarily as much as one wanted to, at least it's a step in the right direction. So I'm surprised at you guys that have not sort of stuck your hand up and said, yeah, it's heading in the right direction.
Or not.
Or not.
Yeah. Does someone want to talk a bit more about it? Whoever put a hand up, or someone who didn't put a hand up, or they didn't put a hand up? Yeah, a little friend there.
Can I ask another question?
You may. This is your floor.
C'est pour Bridget. Comment le commerce avec la France a-t-il été affecté par le Covid-19?
Excusez-moi, vous pouvez répéter la question?
Comment le commerce avec la France a-t-il été affecté par le Covid-19?
Comment la France a été affectée par le Covid? C'est ça la question?
Les échanges avec la France.
L'échange avec la France?
Oui.
L'échange entre la Grande-Bretagne et la France ou les échanges...
Avec la Grande-Bretagne et la France.
Shall I switch to English?
I would.
Because it just... I mean, I'm not sure my colleagues...
No, we got it.
Or I can switch to Russian or whatever, but you have to tell, it just... Yeah, I don't think... I mean, okay, the question is the following, how the pandemic has affected the exchange, the trade between the UK and France. Is that right, yeah? Yeah. I will say it's not so much COVID. It's rather something that is called Brexit. And we have a president that when he got elected, he's slightly in dysfunction with the French people because he's extremely pro-European. And so he took the Brexit vote almost as if somebody was trying to offend him personally. So it's basically, he has picked up all kind of little battles. I'm not saying that the fishing, those fishing boats, those fishing communities are extremely affected and they are poor and it's very sad. But let's say that right now, how the French government, especially the French president, is going about it is extremely awkward, especially because at the end, the British were extremely clever by calling, that was the irony, the help of the European Union, and the Commission can only say that Britain is right. So it's a very tricky question. But right now, if you hear your French news, you will think that we are back and we are going to have the Battle of Hastings or one of those, But somehow, I'm not quite sure we are there yet. But it's not good.
Mark, can I just come back on the international institution?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's a really good question. I need to caveat it by saying essentially I'm a bit of a caveat here. There are many things that are imperfect in the world, but all my reflex is to be internationalist to almost every problem that we face and the world faces here. And I accept the post-Second World War Bretton Woods settlement. It was institutions created by the victors, to a degree has served them well. But actually, it provides the framework for international law that most people sign up to. I think most of the things that seem really important to us in the course of human history are quite small, really, that we get bent around the axle of. And I think we are facing something with climate change, if unchecked, will be the biggest, COVID will be long forgotten and all those sorts of things. Climate change, if completely unchecked, will fundamentally change so many things in the world. And it will affect all those who you could line up and say aren't taking the action. The Chinese didn't come along, but actually they're not stupid. They are very susceptible to this. If you look through the 4,000 years of Chinese civilization, you must remember that they were civilized and had great commerce and enterprise and trade, whilst we were still painting our faces funny colors and running around. But if you look at all the dynasties that have been through in China, they have generally fallen every 300 to 400 years as there is an uprising from the peasantry, or by natural disaster caused by floods and disaster in the great river valleys. And I can't believe that the likes of Xi Jinping is not aware of that if he wants to look after the country. So I think, you know, the imperfect, sometimes you've got to live with the imperfect and just make it work as well as you can. And I think, you know, for all of us, I think trying to take an international view. The other one is in terms of leadership in the world. And, you know, it seems I look back on history and there's such an intrusive view into politics these days that everything is on a tight cycle, that there's an argument that our leaders aren't leaders. You're successful if you react to best and most quickly to things that are bubbling up rather than setting the pace for people. And I would quite like to see a bit of moral courage of not governing by sort of focus group and social media feed, but by conviction. And I can't help resisting think that actually the vast bulk of our population would welcome that as well. But maybe I'm just naive.
I think in terms of COP26, I think the government and businesses could do more to engage our generation, because it's not necessarily the older generations that are going to get the main impact of the environmental. It's our generation and future generations that are going to have it hit hardest, but we're not being taught enough, I don't think, about it, and I think it could be talked about more between businesses and the government, because I feel like that's maybe why the older generation aren't doing more for the environment, because it's not necessarily them that's going to pick up the tab for it in the long run.
So I personally missed the last bit of what was said. Sorry, did you hear?
Can you summarize?
Can I summarize? And you must correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the short answer is that the younger generation are going to live with it. They're going to have to pay for it, and are not being listened to sufficiently by an older generation who are most probably time limited on this planet. Is that the gist of your point? Yeah, thank you.
Is that a shared view? Because I happen to agree with you, for what it's worth, that I think, you know, we brought ourselves to this place, and you know, we've got a duty to empower you as the next incoming generation to define the world as you need it to be. And again, it was what I was trying to ask about the COP26. Do you feel you're being armed enough to be able to do that? So I'll leave that as a hanging question, because we've got a friend at the back, a young man here, and then there was someone here with a hand up a second ago. Yep, okay. So is it man in blue at the back? Yep.
It's been talked about that the European Union might collapse because of financial difficulties. And I wondered if such an unthinkable thing was to happen, how would it affect companies in Europe and all around the world?
Great question. Guys?
I can take that. Yeah, the European Union can collapse, not so much because, mainly because more and more people in the European Union start to feel that they are not listened. They are not listened on question of safety, on migration, of identity, exactly all the themes that the Brits voted for Brexit. And so it may indeed collapse. And there will be economic consequences. But if you look at how the European Union works, and if you look right now which country has benefited from the European Union, you will see that essentially there is one country that has benefited, and that is Germany. And all the others, with the exception of Netherlands, all the surplus countries, that is about 3, all the rest have not done very well. If you look at Italy, since they joined the euro, they had no growth whatsoever. If you look at Greece, you cannot really argue that they have benefited from the European Union. So whether it will be a problem if the European Union collapses, I'm not sure.
There was a hearing, wasn't there, where you talk about Italy and Greece. It was pigs, wasn't it?
Pigs, Portugal,
Italy, Greece and Spain. Yeah.
Yes, Spain.
Who suffered horribly, didn't they, at the back of the economic crash?
Exactly.
Gearing to themselves.
So,
Lars,
sorry. Can I just chip in? So I guess the question for me is, can there be, or should there be, currency integration without fiscal integration? But, you know, I don't think there could and should be one without the other, because hence the problem.
Of course. But you need also you cannot have it without political.
Precisely, and therein lies a horrible, vicious spiral, isn't it?
Exactly.
But for me, I don't think the European Union will collapse. I just don't. I think there may be some fracture lines periodically, but I think they will be healed. And I think the eastern side of Europe is very keen on it, particularly from a defence perspective. I think that's the key, one of the key motivators to gain, the defence knowledge and wisdom to consolidate.
You have to distinguish between European Union and the Eurozone.
Yes.
Lars, would you mind if I just went slightly out of turn and asked a young friend speak?
This was on the comment made earlier, where to a certain extent, don't you feel like we as people, as the young generation, we need to do not more, but instead of focusing and prioritizing the government trying to help out environmentally, we should do something now? Because let's say the government was to help out environmentally, how long will it take for us to change, for those effects to actually matter?
And what do you think doing something now looks like for you?
Well, especially for schools, I feel like for our school, it's not like lessons and stuff like that. It's not spoken as much as other topics. So just different things like that, or because I know in our school we had it today where people were speaking about what's going on in the environment and making sure that people are aware as to what is going on right now, whereas people just hear, oh, global warming, oh, it's just that, and actually learn about what's actually going on.
So learning with a calls to positive action now,
yeah,
to make a change.
To make a change now, yeah, of course.
Excellent. I think that's great. Sorry, Lars.
And just looking at the panel, if you're sort of back, you're 16, 17 years old now, what are the opportunities? What are the careers? What are the things people should do to benefit from globalization or maybe from collapse of globalization in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
I'm feeling that's a question being asked that way. Obviously, present company, because clearly we're just very young folk. Where do you feel your future careers lay? I mean, and putting a slight entrepreneur's slant on the question from our point of view. I mean, I think there are many of us here that started with careers and jobs that turned into becoming entrepreneurs. I mean, do you feel that you would go into a traditional workplace, or do you feel your life would lie of applying your own trade to do your own things?
Sorry, this is a different question. What I was asking, sorry. Yeah.
Can I answer this question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry. Wait, I didn't hear. What was the question, sorry?
No, I was just interested to know, with your future pathways laying ahead, and it was picking up Lars, Master's question, that what does the world of work look like for you going forward? I mean, you know the world of work we're in, you know what your parents would do and everything else, but what does it look like? What can you do? How would you work? What would your place of work and making that change be?
I feel like with our generation, especially because of how we're a lot more vocal, I feel like it may be that bit more just efficient, because we will actually communicate with what we want to say, whereas in past generations, they would have an opinion but wouldn't want to voice it. They would just keep it behind and hope that another person would pick it up. Whereas with our generation, we want to put our foot down now. So I feel like our career choices will be probably a lot more diverse in a way, because mainly because people will decide that I can do this because this is a topic where I can actually make a difference in. Whereas, like I was saying before, people may have not decided to do that, either due to different stimuluses that they were fed when they were younger, and that sort of thing, that sort of vibe, yeah.
So again, I'm just trying to keep this in the context of globalisation. Do you think your local voice has an opportunity to have global influence? Do you feel that platform's sitting there for you? And if it's not, how do we make that for you?
I feel like the platform is there. We just have to get up onto that platform and use it properly. With, for example, Greta Thunberg, she decided to use that platform and just made a massive change with people her age and our age and younger actually talking about it. So, yeah, I feel like the platform is there. We just actually need to properly use it.
And a voice is going to be heard.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Guys, you want to put any comments over the top of that before we get to our friend's next question?
I mean, I'll just endorse what the young gentleman said. I think I grew up in a society which was much more deferential. When I was your age, I don't think we had a voice at all. It was much more preordained what you would do, and all those sort of factors. And the fact, you were citing Greta Thunberg there. I mean, that's almost sort of inconceivable. The only opinion formers when I was young were those that went on to become rock stars or anything like that. It was, so I think it's entirely good. The only downside about being young there is you get older. And, when you get older, your attitudes, different pressures, you do change a bit. So what we need to do is get together in 20 years' time and hear what you've got to say.
Lovely, thank you. We had that question there, yeah.
Do you think the UK will want to rejoin the EU in the future if the current trends stay the same?
Again, sorry, this sounds out of
Sorry,
your
I
think you
said-
were asking, do you think we should rejoin
Yeah,
the
do you think the
European
UK will want to rejoin the EU if the current trends stay the same?
It's those last few words. You've got
If trade stays
If
the
the
same,
current
I think.
trends
If the trend stays
trends
thank you,
stay the
thank
same.
you.
Oh, trends, right.
Who wants to pick that one up? Serena, you've been quiet for a little while.
It would be entirely funny for me to watch that happen. I don't think I have a definite answer on this, sorry. So I don't think so, but maybe others think differently.
Peter?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think it would be surreal, but there we go.
What, no more surreal than the way the world is at the moment. Brigitte?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. What did you say?
So given the current trends that are going on, do you think it's right, should we consider rejoining the EU, European Union?
This is, I think what is good here is that people have voted and nobody is contesting this vote. And this is what I call democracy. So I don't see why this should be asked again.
Of course, the future is unknowable by definition.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it's entirely plausible. The world, we tend to think in the day we're living that this is the norm that will last, and actually it isn't. The world in 10 years and 20 years will be very different, and who can tell what will happen then? I think, if there's a predominant feeling, if you were just talking about the Eurozone and separate out from the EU and different integration, and if the nature of the EU was to change, and there are pressures in the East and the South and everything else, so who knows? Who knows?
But would that be the UK with or without Scotland? Or we're not going there.
There is somebody.
As I say, we've got probably one more question in there, so.
When Brexit was happening, it was almost a trade deal with the US between England and USA, but then the talks broke down. If the EU was to collapse, would you personally think that there would be a trade deal with the US?
Go on, I'm looking lovingly down the table.
You're usually the one that understands questions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I've got to translate the question. I think you were saying if the EU trade sort of breaks down, do you think that that would assist a trade deal with the United States, would you? Right, now I've done the translation, over to you guys. I've got a view, but after you. So.
Honestly, I don't think so. I don't think that'll make any difference. The US is after what's good for the US.
Exactly.
And if the US see that a trade deal with the UK as a result of a breakdown of the EU is a good thing, then they'll do it. If they don't, they won't. I mean, they are is it retrenchment or whatever the word is in the jargon, one cannot overemphasize how much the US looks after the US.
I agree. Right, last question.
Do you think there'll become a time where the world can rely on consumer choice to limit the impact on the climate, or will the government have to step on it at some point, e.g. fuel tax?
Did you catch that?
Yeah, it's whether can we rely on consumer choice to save, the climate crisis because of, I guess, incentives and technology, or do you think the government will have to intervene?
Okay, well, you're not going to copy up this time, so you go first and then Brigitte.
My view is that the inventiveness of the human species is so creative, and the cauldron of inventiveness is necessity, and the less you can regulate it and interfere with it and hold people back, the better. So I think we've got to give free rein to inventiveness and enterprise to solve it. But equally, I think it's so large that a degree of government intervention will be in there. So, for instance, one thing in the comprehensive spending review that I was delighted to see was, it gets lost in the headline figures, but the investment in scientific research into solving some of the energy conundrums that we've got can be stimulated by government, but actually it's down to 1,000,001 citizens and organisations and universities and industry to really get on and solve the problem.
Thank you, Daniel. Brigitte?
Yeah, I agree with that, but also it's a question of living standard. It's easier for some rich people to be very environment aware, and it's much more difficult when you are struggling to make sure that everybody has enough to eat.
No, just to add, just that there's probably even like a higher third level in that. So it's not just consumers and national governments, but there's also the fact that this same dynamic that you're referring to also applies to differences between countries. So it might be a luxury for us to talk today about climate change, but in some other places they need to get work down to bring food home. By the end of the day, they're not as concerned as we are. So there's also like imbalances in this. So there's a third level of international and supranational governance that needs to be taken into account.
Last word, Peter.
So I'd just go back to Duncan's point about a nudge from the government. I think that's absolutely right, but I also go back to the governance point of view, the free market economy element. As this rises up the political, social agenda, it will become, shareholders will put pressure on their investee companies, and they will require them to do more and create more initiative, and it will become a virtuous circle. And I'm absolutely a believer in that. So pressure from a little bit of pressure, a little bit of nudge, a little bit of incentivization, a kickstart from government, but then will it build up its own momentum and inertia because it's the right thing. I don't think anybody would dispute, climate change and dealing with that is not the right thing to do. And if it can be cycled into good governance and good returns and profitable companies, then you're on a winner.
Excellent. Time is beyond us, so thank you first off for all your contributions. And I think another customary round of applause to Brigitte, Peter, Serena, Duncan for their fabulous insights. Thank you. Excellent.
you.